I'm so very honored to share the stage with Lodrina today as our co-host. And so excited for her to deliver a keynote this morning. As Lodrina just shared, she's a SAN certified instructor, an amazing speaker, and more than all of her accolades and her achievements, she provides much needed representation in an industry that lacks the presence of women of color. And I remember meeting Lo about a year and a half ago. I believe it was in the summer of 2019 at the BIPOC Summit in Austin, Texas. And, immediately I was just like, wow, and I thought to myself, here's someone I can show my daughter who looks like her and sounds like her, who's crushing it in cyber, and who she can aspire to be more like when she grows up. And so, that's no different than many of you who are joining in today. Maybe you aspire to be like Lodrina at some point, and I'm here to tell you that you can do it. In fact, my challenge to you today is to listen in to all that she's going to share, engage with her in the hallway throughout today. And that said, I'll pause and I'll allow Lodrina to take the stage and share some good stuff.
Thank you so much, Stephen. So I really appreciate that introduction and also the level setting of why we're here, talking about words and how they matter and how what words mean to everybody in the room is something that's important. I'm going to talk about the language of equality, and I'm going to talk about words and the language we use, but I'm first going to tell a couple of stories. And my first story is something that I've experienced myself. For those who don't know me, Stephen gave me a great introduction, described me as a forensics instructor, and host-based forensics is what I love to do. I am such a huge nerd. If you know one thing about me, I'm a big nerd. I think I have superpowers. Like, I think that I can see lots of things in hex at a quick glance, like file types, like dates and times, when to everybody else, that all looks like gibberish. But I've worked really hard at those skills. And I've worked really hard to share information that I've learned with that and other artifacts with others. And it's been a really long time that I've had to develop those skills over the course of a decade in forensics, over the course of my time getting my computer science degree, developing problem solving and critical thinking skills. And I am really proud of all of the work that I have put into my skills and my accomplishments to this point. So I'll share a story about one time when I was getting ready to upgrade my forensics lab. I had a little bit of downtime and was gearing up for a big case. And I went into the local computer store and I ordered 6 of the biggest, fastest, best desktops that they had. So I researched all the specs, and not only did I get these 6 big fancy computers, I upgraded them with the best SSDs, I maxed out the memory, I put hot swap bays in them. So I'm finally going to the computer store, I am picking up all these systems, and it's a pretty amusing sight, because not only am I wheeling them up to the cash register in a shopping cart, I've got one of those big carts like a contractor would use at a home improvement store. So I'm pushing this big cart up to the register. I've got the sales slip in my hand. I hand it to the cashier. They're checking me out. I've got my credit card in my hand, ready to pay. And the cashier turns to my husband, who's standing beside me, and says, "Sir, do you want an extended warranty on those systems?" And I was shocked. I didn't quite know what to say. Luckily, my husband did. He didn't skip a beat, said, "I don't know why you're asking me that question. She's the one purchasing these computers. And I would like to add spending a lot of money on them." So in that moment, I was frozen because I felt slighted. I felt othered. I felt like I wasn't valued as the professional that I so much take pride in being. And I didn't know if that interaction happened because I'm a woman, because I'm a person of color, because of both of those things, because intersectionality is something we can talk a lot about when you're underrepresented in the workplace. You don't stop being, in my case, a woman of color when you walk into work and suddenly you're an employee. But this is the kind of interaction that can happen in the workplace. It can happen when you walk into a boardroom. If you are a minority, if you are an underrepresented person in technology, you can come into a boardroom with all of the best information, you can put on your best suit, and you can know your stuff and maybe still have the experience of being talked over or not having your opinions be heard. So this is the kind of experience, and again, I can only speak to my experience, but I think is somewhat representative of what if you are BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, or person of color, or otherwise from an underrepresented community in tech, what you can experience in the real world. Now I want to tell you a story that moves online. And this might be the only time that you hear a successful story about when screaming at the internet worked. So earlier this year, I was online on Twitter and I saw a tweet from somebody who had been a student at SANS. And this person tweeted, and I will say, screaming into the void of the internet, you know, I just took a class at SANS and I heard the terms blacklist and whitelist and master and slave used throughout the class. I think we can do better. I saw that tweet. I let the person who said it know that I agreed and that I would try and help do something about it. So this is another example of coming to a professional environment, coming to a training class, and feeling othered, feeling slighted. And for those of you who are wondering what the issue is with those terms and using them in a professional environment, it's this. The idea of blacklisting, let's say something in a network, is that we want to prevent traffic that's bad. And conversely, a whitelist is that we want to allow traffic that's good. At its most basic, we are reinforcing the incorrect concept that black is bad and white is good. And when we talk about terms like master and slave, which in technology is such a common term, if you step outside of our bubble of technology, and as I share that term exists with friends who are teachers and educators, they are shocked that this is language we would use among our professional peers. So what do we do about this? Well, I knew as soon as I saw that tweet and as soon as I brought up the issue to other people at SANS, I knew that this is something that we would change. But when I say something that we will change, and I have a slide that says that, I want to put a little asterisk by the word we. Because when I talk about we, this is not something that SANS is doing in a vacuum. This is something that has been a topic of conversation, particularly in 2020, as we talk about race, as we talk about the murder of George Floyd and the killing of Breonna Taylor. And it is something that, as far as changing language, has been a topic of conversation at many other companies in our industry. When I talk about other companies, I'm talking about companies like Google, like Microsoft, companies like Twitter, like GitHub, and Cisco. Now, I know about these initiatives and can name these companies because it's something that has come to the surface, again, in 2020, due to increased and higher visibility conversations that we're having about race and race relations, and how to elevate voices that are traditionally marginalized and how to make them feel represented. But I think for a lot of those companies, and I suspect that a lot of these conversations and changes were already underway, and that they were just brought to light by some of the conversations that we are having today. So when I say we, I mean the greater technical and cybersecurity community. So how about the we when I talk about the we at SANS, about us as educators? Well, we have worked over the past few months on starting the process of changing the words that we use in our classes, with our students, and with each other. And I really want to stress more than anything else that this is a process. So among the group of people who is really core in working on this initiative are a number of other instructors at SANS and community and staff members. And as this event approached, as this October 1st BIPOC and cybersecurity event approached, we hemmed and hawed about, do we come up with a list of terms that we share today, that we make a public statement about, we are changing these terms in our classes? And we really wanted to stress, instead of coming up with a list and saying, this is what we're doing, we wanted to stress that this is a process that has a lot of nuance to it, that starts with soliciting input. So we are really in the process of a conversation that starts with, what words do we replace? And I've talked about terms like whitelist, why we want as professionals to move away from that term. But what about something like whiteboard? Do we remove a term like whiteboard from our terminology because it has the word white in it? And same thing for blackboard. Well, maybe if when you were a kid, you had to clean out and dust erasers from a blackboard, you might have negative connotations with that term. But if we think about it in the big picture, those terms are slightly different, and we don't want to just avoid using the terms white and black wholesale. We want to think thoughtfully about what terms we want to identify as being problematic and what replacements could be. Do we start with terms like the ones I've mentioned, and do we talk about man-in-the-middle attacks? Man-in-the-middle may be implying that only men can be technically adept hackers. Do we remove the phrase evil maid attack and how that disparages women? Do we talk about segmented networks instead of segregated networks? Could that be an improvement we make? And by the way, as a parallel effort to this conversation, are there other terms that maybe aren't racially charged that we could replace as best practices in our day-to-day conversations? One example would be using the term child sexual abuse material instead of child pornography. Something that is a more professional term and something that is more accurate as well. So let's talk about replacements. Let's talk about using segmented networks instead of segregated networks. And what do we use instead of something like whitelist? Well, it's going to depend on the scenario. We're talking about using terms like allow list or safe list. For blacklist, depending on the case, using block list, deny list, or block senders list. And as far as master slave goes, you could talk about primary and secondary devices, initiators and responders, or a controller and a device. Now I want to acknowledge that we also have to talk about industry standards, and that something like certain NIST standards or that the Bluetooth spec talk repeatedly about terms like master and slave? And how do we get around that there are standards in our industry that use these terms, and how do we move on and help our industry get better? Well, by the way, this is a conversation that's happening at the industry level. This is underway as a conversation at NIST. This is underway at organizations like ITI and like the IETF. And right now at the IETF, there is an RFC, request for comments, about changing this terminology, in particular, blacklist, whitelist, and master slave, and recommending that we remove that terminology as a standard. As a standard. So this is not something that we're doing in a bubble. We are reaching out to our peers in the cybersecurity community. We are having conversations and soliciting input and figuring out how we move forward. So when I talk about moving forward, how actually is it that we are making progress? I've already shared with you that as an organization, and I have to credit the group of SANS instructors and staff who is helping with this initiative, that we are identifying problematic terms and replacements. After that, we are looking at taking those terms out of our printed courseware. In the meantime, we have already worked with GIAC, the certifying body that SANS works closely with, to remove the terms that I have just mentioned from the GIAC test banks, so that again, as a cybersecurity professional, you should not find yourself sitting in an exam, seeing terms that remind you that you feel othered, that remind you that you are in an industry that thinks master and slave is an okay term to use. We want to help people realize that they do belong. And part of that is not just changing the words that we use and doing a find and replace once we've identified words and their alternatives. This is part of a broader effort that is happening at SANS. And right now, if you do go to the sans.org website and you look under About, you will find a diversity page. And you will hear about our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force that is made up from different individuals across the SANS organization, where we are not only working on the language that we use in our classes and in our events, but we are also looking at how do we broaden the cybersecurity pipeline? What are the initiatives that we're undertaking at the K-12 level? And to reskill and upskill people who maybe are already adults, working professionals, but who want to enter cybersecurity. Also, how does that apply to our instructor pool? How can we get more people who are traditionally underrepresented in our field up on stage and in front of classes, instructing the next generation of cybersecurity professionals? And by the way, if you go to that webpage, one thing that you will find is an email address to contact this task force, where you can provide your feedback on what you want to see as part of inclusion in cyber. So that page is there for you. And that page is a resource that we hope we'll add to in the future. You will have plenty of opportunity to give us feedback on this event in particular that you'll see in the slides that come up at break time. But that, again, is some of the work that we at SANS and from different parts of the organization are undertaking to be more inclusive in cybersecurity, to make sure that we can raise and elevate voices from all different backgrounds. And we look forward to continuing the conversation with you.